Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the delight of speaking with the one and only Sam, greener side of Sam, a tremendous writer and friend, and it is so wonderful to have the chance to speak with her today. And she has written a wonderful story, The Mermaid, which I very much enjoy, that we are going to talk about. And so, Sam, just to begin, if you just say who you are, and I'd be curious what inspired the story, maybe inspirations, and thank you so much for your time today. I really look forward to it. We always have a lot of fun. So, Sam, thank you.
Thank you for having me here. I always love discussing anything with you guys. So, I'm Samantha Green, and my channel is Greener Side of Sam. And I've been doing some philosophical discussions, and I have literary pieces where I analyze literature, and I also write short stories, a lot of short stories, and you can find some of those on greenersideofsam.com. This particular story is actually a sequel to a story I wrote for a short story collection called Under the Cement. And this story actually has to do with the brother of I think it was either a preacher or a priest. I can't remember what exactly it was. It was the brother of I'll just say preacher in the first story. And we just kind of dive into where he came from. Because in the first story, the brothers meet up at the very end, and I don't want to give it away, but they have like a kind of a little bit of a dialogue. And I was like, well, what would be the brother's story? And so the brother in the story is like a fisherman, and he gets pulled into the sea by a mermaid. And I thought it would be interesting to do this story in a way where, because you always see those pirate and those sailor stories where they're pulled into the sea by the mermaids, but you never know what happens to them. They're just kind of gone into the void, right? Um, but this one, I was like, okay, but what happens in the void specifically? And it's kind of funny. I just kind of had the idea and I wrote it in a couple days. And I just used some of my poetry from the previous story and I merged it with this one to kind of make it fit this brother's side of the story. So that's that's just what I did. I was like, sounds good. And then I just sat down for a few hours and I wrote something.
Hey, some of the best works come from that sitting down and just making it happen. So I salute that. In fact, just like 2 days ago, there was an idea. I was like, oh, I need to go and just put it out and make it happen. So I salute you on that. Well, the style, I very much appreciate the language. I think there's quite a lot of beauty to it. This opening paragraph, there are mermaids in the deep waiting until you fall asleep. When the sea salt brushes your nose and the seagulls call on the edge of the boat when there is nothing but the shifting of blue and only the wind to guide you, does a man have permission to cry? And I like that image that you're setting in the waiting until you fall asleep. I think it's just very important that language, the use of the terms also reflect their meaning. When you have waiting, that is waiting, right? Because you're waiting and you're still on the word waiting. And when you go waiting,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like waiting. And I think also with that opening paragraph, there's almost the movement of a boat kind of in the way that it is described, where you feel like, okay, waiting until you fall asleep. And also that's kind of a rocking structure. And I think it's quite lovely to bring together the ship in this kind of dream, because there is something about rocking of a boat kind of movement where you're in a dream state, but you're also not in a dream state. And I think also water is so interesting because of primordial waters, where creation, ex nihilo, all of these things come together. Because there's an interesting relationship between the void, the mermaid, the ocean, this void where anything is possible. But is it possible because it's an illusion or because it's actually a place where the ocean makes you give up all of your ideas of how things are because you've gone on a journey, so you're taken to a new place. There's that wonderful line where the mermaid, where does she say, when he pulls them underwater and says, most men choose to swallow in the water Whereas Thomas, he's pulled in and he's willing to go into the model. I thought that was very interesting because it also suggests that most people, rather than go through the depths, rather be killed by the depths along the way. So there's really
Hmm.
subtle language moves there that I think is very nice. But I'm going to read the second paragraph and then ask you a question. So this is the second one after the opening. And I also like how you began with the poetry. I was, as I was reading this, thinking, I mentioned to you, William Butler Yeats. It has a bit of that Irish sort of language to it, that kind of mystical, always the one, the stolen child, come away with me, you stolen child, for this world is full of suffering that you cannot understand. Come away with me, stolen child, the way that Yeats kind of works. And I feel that
Oh,
personally.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that.
oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful work, William Butler Yeats, and the ways that he will incorporate some of the mythology, or where when the circus animals are gone, No Country for Old Men, which obviously became a famous title of a book by McCarthy. But I'll read the second paragraph. Perhaps that is why Thomas became a fisherman. When the land rejected him, he could be nowhere in the middle of the sea, remembering the days of the faun in the forest when he had followed his brother and father in secret on their hunting trip. It was the last time tears fell from his eyes in front of anyone else. Seeing his reflection in the eyes of a faun opened his heart to the nature of God. The animal stood still for him, letting him reach out to touch its soft fur, and to a child this was the closest thing to magic. At that moment, the heavens opened like doors in the sky, rays of sunlight kissing his cheeks. Bam! Now, I will also note that the second paragraph, the first paragraph is much more of a kind of ocean structure with the kind of movement of it. The next one is almost scenes flashing, just like a memory, because you have a sentence period, much less of commas connecting the sort of flow of the water. So I think there's an awareness um, of what the paragraph is about and how the way the language is used needs to shift based on what the paragraph is about. That was an impression I got, certainly. But when you mention a fawn, that again brings me to Yeats. So what are some of the relationships, I'm curious, between the fawn and the mermaid and that imagery of the fawn that you're opening up with? And it is very interesting to start with, he became a fisherman, and then immediately start talking about a fawn memory. You would expect it to be a memory of, say, going fishing or going to a lake or something, but instead, maybe that's why he became a fisherman. And that's why, because it was a fawn and there was a kind of rejection there. I'd be curious, any thoughts or comments that come to mind there, Sam?
So the fawn has a lot to do in this story with innocence, and like that's the imagery of the fawn is keeping that childlike innocence, and that's why I said the line. It was something uh like the heavens opened,
Mm,
because to to a child that was like the most magical and magnificent thing, and then bam, it was just like taken away. So that was kind of a rejection the of the land, and it was more so a rejection of his innocence. Like after that is like innocence, his innocence was gone because of his father shooting the fawn. But so he goes into the sea to try and gosh, get away from it and kind of find his place somewhere. But because he was rejected on land, but um, but then he's met with a mermaid, and the mermaid is like, if you for anyone who's watching, if you read it, she's this like grotesque looking creature at first, and so he doesn't even like, so it's almost like worse than, or worse going out to sea than being on land. So it's like whatever happened on land must have been so bad that he felt the need to actually go out into the sea and find himself. So in this story, it has a lot to do with talking about the masculine and feminine. And the masculine has a lot to do with what's on land, and the feminine has a lot to do with what's in the water, the depths of the sea, the void. Um, but okay, so whatever happened on land must have had to be so bad that this man ventured out into the sea to find whatever it was he was trying to get back, which was his innocence. And his innocence had a lot to do with like seeing the fawn and being able to cry.
Well, I think the use and the ideas of the masculine and the feminine, I appreciate it in the story as well, because they're actually in a very intricate and interesting conversation with one another, as opposed to either or. There's more of how they interrelate and how they actually help, well, bring out something that can't be known without one another. Like on this idea of the feminine being kind of the void, someone would see that as kind of negative, but actually the void is something that the masculine needs to go into, right? And so, the void is more apathetic, right? Because there's something very interesting about the fishermen. You have this loss of innocence, um, that then leads to a going out to sea. But is one facing the void until they get into the sea? Where the masculine is instead riding the void, right? There's a kind of protection where it looks like you're taking it on, but actually you might just be fleeing into the void versus facing the void.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something about the masculine that actually will honestly tend to flee into the void versus face the void. And there's something about the feminine that's actually
Mm-hmm.
like, well, come on, you'll actually see that there's a fullness to the void. Yeah, I can kill you, but if you can get to the bottom of it, you can have a certain beauty come out. And if you don't, and you're actually able to get through, you might be able to sort of find what you were looking for, but you would have never looked here for it. You would have kept just going along the void, not going into the depths of the void. A few more comments. I thought it was very interesting when you described the fawn's blood was gray at the beginning. Bam. Thomas could have sworn the fawn's blood was gray, and when his father emerged from the woods to shake him senseless. There's something interesting there, just as a note. I liked how you introduced gray because it added a dreamlike quality to the story very suddenly on the blood being gray. Because in your mind, you're like, well, maybe it is gray before the light hits it. Isn't it where blood's kind of blue before, but then it's like, maybe it's dreamlike. Maybe that's an intentional mistake pointing to surrealist elements in the story. And I just wanted to note that as a detail, because as the story then introduces a real mermaid, it's already kind of gradually sort of introduced elements to make you as the reader understand the rules of the story per se gradually as you go along. Because one of the mistakes I think writers can make is if there are no introductory elements that suggest that the story may not follow a purely naturalistic logic, it may start moving into more of a fairy tale direction. Then it can be too sudden, it can be too immediate, and it can cause a how do I put it, a jerk. The reader is kind of over. It's like Deus Ex Machina all of a sudden, right? So it's just very
Yeah.
important to introduce slowly in your story elements that make the reader go, oh, that's odd. Fawn's blood is gray. Maybe there's some sort of dream element here. But then you go, but wait a minute, blood isn't exactly red until oxygen hits it. So maybe it was gray, right? And that kind of ambiguity space between scientific fact and fantasy, I think gradually accustoms the reader to get used to the kind of story we're dealing with. So I thought that was a very interesting line to put in there. And I do also like the subtle language. Sotramelia, you have the Latin, you have all these different kind of languages that are brought in. That also, for me, is a subtle way to move a story into more the fairy tale, the magical, these different ways. Because whenever one reads an alternative language, there's always something mysterious about that if you don't know the language. There's something magical about it. It's like a spell is being said, even if it's just a term in a different language. The very use of alternative language in of itself creates a certain feeling of magic, because it's like reading a magic spell on page if you don't know what it means. So I think that's another subtle way to gradually accustom the reader into the story and the kind of story that will be told. But as our dear Thomas is moving out to sea, I'll read another paragraph here that I thought was beautiful. His stomach was empty, and they didn't bring him much food that day, but the stoic man could already feel the shadows creeping up his spine. He took a long drink, and feeling his chest burn, they sailed further to sea. A glaze came over his blue eyes, and soon, after a few more drinks, the slate sky took over their color. The ocean opened its jaw and took him in. Thomas became the water, swaying, feeling nothing at all, nothing at all, nothing at all, nothing at all. And when the tentacles from the deep crept upon the deck, wrapping around his legs, he thought nothing of it. For the pain of his innocence lost had been doled down to an empty bottle of whiskey. The stench of the gray blood of the creature only lingered, and the horrid screams of his father ceased. The sacrifice for the bottle to drink, he had forgotten the song his mother used to sing. and you have it in the alternative language I cannot pronounce, but the Millerosium will get the best of you. Throw down your sword of virtue, submerge into the deep. Laugh with us as we sing. Well, maybe I did get through the Millerosium. I tried. The fishermen are coming. The fishermen are coming. Don't you swim under ocean's absorbent tea. The ocean will swallow you up, his mother would tell him, explaining the Latin in her song, but the words had faded in his memory and settled to a low hum. I find it very interesting the relationship between drink and going to ocean. Like often men can deal with the void, perhaps by drinking, which is not the same as encountering the void, right? Like kind of
Mm-hmm.
the difference between drink and the mermaid pulling you in are different. Maybe drink get you into a place where the mermaid can pull you in, or something can get you. But there's a difference between, in my opinion, and I'd be curious any thoughts you have on this, the difference between drinking and this idea of became the water swaying, feeling nothing at all. I feel like there are subtle differences between this identification with the water, with the void, and actually being pulled into the void.
Mm-hmm.
I might be reading that into it, but I think the story is playing on. But again, I don't mean to tell you what the story means. One of the things I got out of it
No,
is the
no.
subtle play between the like again going into the void and plunging into the void, using the void to avoid versus the void to face, and
Mm-hmm.
how both the masculine and the feminine have some sort of relation to the void, but the masculine is more of an along or getting lost in, where the feminine is more of a facing. I'll throw it at any comments on anything.
Mm-hmm. So I always love to hear what people have to say about it because sometimes they pick up things that I didn't even realize
Oh,
that I
sure.
was doing, like the cadence you were talking about. I was like, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. But it's interesting to me too that because I've been trying to study the masculine and feminine for a very long time and trying to explain what they are exactly and to try and give them a sort of new elevated definition from what we've seen in our culture. And I figured that the only way to really explain a complex idea such as this is to do it in a story. And the connection you made with kind of being on the surface of the void and acknowledging it to being actually pulled into the void was so so good and exactly spot on, Daniel. Okay, and I have to use a modern example of
Please.
this, and I've been using this example a lot, but it's a really good one. So you'll have like a man and a woman, and I hate to make generalizations,
Oh, please.
but for this for this story, um, you'll see a lot of women. They'll be faced with a problem, and they want to talk about it. They want to talk all about it, lay it all on the table, every single detail. And the man in the relationship is like, I don't understand like why we need to talk about the problem. We just need to fix the problem. And and I remember explaining to a friend one day, I was like, well, the women are also trying to fix the problem. But the problem is that they are trying to fix is not the problem that you see right in front of you that needs to be fixed. The problem that the women are trying to fix is very metaphysical. And sometimes the problem that they are actually trying to fix is, it could be as simple as just changing their mindset to get through the problem that's in front of them, or it could be something extremely complex. So what happens is we just lay it all out on the table. It's kind of like when you go to a door and you realize it's locked, and the guy next to the door says, well, there's a haystack over there, and if you look through all of it, you can find the needle. Well, you lay out all the hay
Yeah.
and you look through everything, and then instead of finding a needle, you actually find a key, and you realize that's the key to the door to actually open it. So it's a much better solution than the needle that you could have used to like pick at the door or whatever. So it's a very like actually going into the void is um is kind of fixing, I wouldn't say fixing, but facing the problem in all of its complexity to try and get to a solution in the masculine and try to create a higher structure or higher form of the structure when it goes back into the masculine. So I'll send it back over to you.
Well, just some comment. Brilliant. Not that the language is perfect, but some ways I think about it is the difference between the method of calculation and the method of apprehension. So calculation is when you go A to B to C, just kind of linear sequential logic. Apprehension, what you would describe with the feminine, lay it all out and then key. An image I always think about with apprehension is one, the FedEx logo, where suddenly you see the negative logo, the arrow, or from Nabokov, you know those pictures where you have a bunch of little pictures, and if you step back, you see the big picture, and you're like, oh, there it is. You know, like the Find the Sailor You Cannot See, like you'll see these kind of illusions where you take a bunch of small pictures. My impression is that some of the feminine understanding is, well, let's take all of the information and lie it out. And then once we do that, oh, now I see, I apprehend suddenly and all at once the picture within the pictures, right? This is I think very, very important because apprehension is mysterious in that you don't calculate, and I just use the FedEx logo because that's a good example. We can say the feminine is lying down the entire story to get the FedEx logo so you can see the negative arrow. Oh, there's the oh, there it is. There's a negative arrow, right? The weird thing is you don't calculate your way to seeing the negative arrow. You apprehend it very suddenly and all at once, right? And there it is. But the calculation is more like, I guess I want to say, a gathering. You're gathering it all up, but it's not so much the calculating mechanism, right? The problem with the masculine is the calculating can be good because it can get the ship across the ocean, but if there's a negative arrow somewhere there, you miss it, right? And that negative arrow in the FedEx sign can actually be really necessary to keep your calculation from actually being escapism, right? You know, it's very interesting because like when Freud associates rationality with masculinity, it's actually that a problem because rationality is almost always rationalism. And the problem is the male very often uses rationality or calculation to rationalize whatever they're doing to avoid the void, basically. And critically, when Freud associates the feminine with hysteria, hysteria means that women are more true. They actually have a greater, they actually know the truth more than men because for Freud, they're in their bodies. You can't escape the body. The male is more able to basically live as if they don't have a body. They're able to be basically, you know, they're not forced into feminine realities, you know, periods, the birth cycle, all these different things. So the male can almost practically live as if their body doesn't exist, right? Even if you ask them, they know better, but they basically can live as if they are a head on a stick. We say all the time, you're not a head on the stick. Well, the male actually almost can get away with that mistake, right? And so for Freud, what that means is men are actually more likely not to know the truth, whereas feminine are more likely to know the truth, but precisely because the truth is a void, it requires going into depths and difficulties and encountering the real in a Lacan sense. It creates a hysterical outcome. But the hysteria is not a sense of irrationality. It's a sign of actually knowing the truth more so. And you see, that's kind of the interesting thing is usually in psychoanalysis, rationality, we're just so used to the Enlightenment making rationality equal true that when we say, oh, men are rational, oh, that must mean they're more right. No, 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 no. They're more likely to actually be putting up barriers. They're able to use the mind to actually avoid the truth. That's the problem with rationality. Rationality is actually usually in service of avoiding the truth or avoiding the void, not to actually face it, right? And what ends up happening basically is that if the male is not forced to go into the void, then they never actually apprehend the thing they need for their rationality and calculation not to be in service of avoidance, right? If they don't go into the void, they are basically going to use their rationality and calculation to avoid the truth. That's what they'll build technologies. They'll say, well, we'll escape death. You could look at transhumanism, you know, in the sense of we're going to overcome the body as basically a ultimate masculine project of avoiding the void, right? Where that just leads, of course, to all sorts of pathologies and troubles. And you never get the beautiful that the story, because Thomas goes into the depth, one can argue that he actually gets the beautiful, right? So, but the great horror then, as well, to your point, is that if the masculine avoids the void, which in their rationality are actually more likely to do because their body does not force them to encounter the truth of reality as much as the feminine does, then if the male moves themselves to a place where they never encounter the beautiful, they also never know they don't encounter the beautiful per se, or they never know they could have developed. And that's the horror, of course, right? And yet it seems to be a crowning achievement. But to me, I just think like we're in such trouble today, and just on your point, because we really don't think thinking works any other way than calculation. And I'm kind of conflating calculation and rationality. We believe there's one way to think, and that's rationality, calculation, and sequence, when really the only way you get at truth is apprehension. You cannot calculate your way to the truth, because if you did so, you would be slicing it up along the way and thus reducing it to something it is not by the time you get there. Truth always has to be apprehended suddenly and all at once, right? And that requires laying out the entire picture, right? And so the masculine, in their very, ironically, the greater the capacity of their calculation, that may just mean the greater the likelihood that they keep themselves from experiencing the truth as a whole, right? But that, of course, would require going into the void. And if you have calculation, you can always find ways to avoid the void, right? Unless you have this almost, it was interesting with the mermaid, because they're almost, and then I'll give it to you for any thoughts. There's almost something deus ex machina, not deus ex, but it's like void ex machina, like it's actually the void is breaking in as a mermaid to save Thomas from this mistake. Like it actually has to come in and precisely in its horror, pull him to where he doesn't make this escape, this mistake of running forever. But it almost, I guess, has to show up as a horror on the onset. It kind of has to show up that way, because no one would, because if you just experienced it as beautiful at the first, well, you would just dive on in. It wouldn't actually, it wouldn't require the difficulty. Well, let me put it this way. If the mermaid just showed up beautiful, then rationality and calculation would have him go into the void, right? Because look, beautiful, so I'll go in, right? But that's not how it works. Like the way rationality and calculation works is to avoid the void, right? So it just simply wouldn't be true to how the relation between the masculine and feminine is, which is the masculine basically has to be pulled in. Something has to basically kind of pull them in and has to be experienced as horrible in that pulling in, or else it would simply fall within the domain of masculine calculation, which is not, that's not how it goes. Those are just some thoughts. I'd be curious, any response to any of that?
Yeah, and it actually made me think of one of my favorite parts. And at first, I want to say that I thought that him choosing to go into the void was when he was being pulled in by the mermaid. But then I thought about it again and I was like, no, no, it's when he put down his knife and he
Hmm.
answered her when she said, "Are you afraid that I'm going to treat you like you've treated me?" And the moment he actually enters into the void and accepts it all for what it is when he says yes,
Hmm.
because he tells her the truth. And it puts him in a really vulnerable position, especially since he puts his knife down. So part of going into the void is putting yourself into that vulnerable position, because honestly, it's anything can happen there, because it's all there, all at once, everywhere, and it's a lot of emotions. But when you choose to go in there, you're not going to get this superficial, like, oh yeah, I'm understanding of that side now. You're actually going to build back on the structure that you had and actually rearrange it. I always the way I was explaining it, because she says a line, the mermaid says a line in there where she says, your logic does not exist
Yes.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
She doesn't say logic
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
exist
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
logic doesn't
That's
exist
good.
here.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of the time in the masculine, it's the structure looks very stable. It's difficult to be moved. But in the feminine, the structure is continuously moving, because it's just, I look at it as kind of like a data of whys, just like collected whys all the time, everything. Um, but it's like a continually moving structure of logic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's continually building on itself. So you can look at it in one moment, but the moment you realize what it is, it's already changed.
Sure.
I watched this documentary once because I women have this like ability uh, that is very metaphysical in nature. Like we really heavily lean on our intuition for
Mm.
some reason. And then, and not saying that men can't either. I've just noticed it a lot more
Yep.
in women. And I watched a documentary called The Gift of Fear.
Mm.
And there's almost like a either a pattern recognition or like an intuitive sense of fear that women have. Like there was this one story of this woman who went to the movies with her daughter and her friends, and there was a guy there, and he didn't look like he was a threat at all, but she just felt something.
Mm.
And he actually ended up um, following her to her car, and before she even realized she did it, she like I guess took her keys and stabbed him.
Yeah.
But and she didn't even realize she had done it until after. So that's kind of what the feminine is like, is you don't even realize what's going on. You can't really catch anything until after. And even if you did catch something, it's not everything in its entirety. Um, I think that was all I was trying to say. But yeah, I'm interested in your ideas of on those particular lines.
Well, I think that's very, very well put. Well, there's something about the masculine that's like, what is the relevant data, right? Like, what's the relevant data and move on to the next, right? But here's the problem. If you have the FedEx sign, the relevant data is that's the FedEx logo. But if I say, no, look at it more, there's something else. We don't have time for that. And you move beyond it and you never see the negative arrow, right? And you see, if life is something where truth is more like a negative space and is found in the void, then the only way to actually get at the truth, to keep rationality from turning into rationalism, which then becomes the autonomous rationality that gets us all replaced by capital AI and all the stuff that smothers us into less human beings. We become very efficient at stuff that doesn't matter. Well, then that's a problem, right? And this idea too of apprehension, where you need the whole, because there's something too where if anything can be potentially something seen from an angle that makes something manifest that was always already there, but had to be something from a different angle, then nothing is static. Nothing is static, because even that bookcase over there that's not moving, if reality entails within itself FedEx signs per se, and everything could have a potential FedEx sign, then there's nothing in reality that is stagnant, even if it's not moving. Because from the right angle or the right position, it can change what it is, right? And this may sound abstract, but it's what the artist does all the time. The artist all the time is positioning themselves relative to their experiences or phenomenon and making a story about them, which in a sense is realizing a latent potential in that thing that requires the relationship between you and the tree to bring out into a new creative possibility, right? Because the FedEx sign having that negative arrow in it is a relational moment, right? You relate with the sign, you're there, and because you stand in the right way, bam, now I see it. Well, artistic inspiration is the same. I've been walking by this tree every single day, and whoa, now I see it, and I need to paint it, right? Inspiration is very similar to the FedEx sign, and I'm just going to keep using that example because I like that example. But that's how apprehension works. That's how intuition works. And that is how the feminine understanding tends to be, right? And that's why it also tends to be creative, because you could argue the most creative acts are those of which cannot plausibly be causal. And what I mean by that is the FedEx sign is so fascinating because it's not like there's any new cause and effect that occurs. There's not new material added to the sign. There's no causality, really. It's the same thing in the same way, and then suddenly you see the arrow. That's a creative act more than a causal act, right? It's not adding anything, really. It's changing the relation to the thing to bring it out in a new way, right? And you could also get into stuff like Owen Barfield, where if you stand in the right place, you see a rainbow, right? A rainbow is not an illusion. It requires conditions that then it appears, right? But you're not adding anything to reality. Rain or light, all these things are there, but if they're coordinated correctly, then you apprehend and experience something you otherwise would not, right? And I think feminine apprehension is very much on that side of things that is also incredibly mysterious because it is suggesting there is something possibly in everything that is not reducible to its material composition, but relative to your relation to it. And it's always already there. But this is not the feminine, but the feminine revelation as well is the understanding that this isn't always necessarily beautiful. It could be monstrous. You know, the void, you have this line here too, where you say, his dream, what a peculiar void of a thing, where the claws come out and rip open the chest. The relation between dream and void is very interesting. And I think that is true, but a dream can also be a nightmare, right? Like the void as this apophatic potential, you know, apophatic is kind of full thing. It's not void is not nothing. You know, we like to say lack is not nothing with Jonkin. It contains a certain pregnancy, and that pregnancy can be some of the deepest beauty out there, but it can also be a Lovecraft creature, right? It can reduce you to ask. But the only way, and I think this is the feminine revelation, the only way to find the truth, the thing that you're looking for, quote unquote, Thomas, whoever, is to go into the void. The thing you are looking for cannot be found anywhere but the void, right? And the void, and the feminine, and I'd be curious any thoughts of to this. The feminine comes to, I think, better intuit that what you are looking for, quote unquote, is not something that can be calculated to. It has to be apprehended, right? And you see, calculation can be useful to creating something to apprehend, you know, building something that can be apprehended in different ways. But if all you ever do is calculate, you will never apprehend. You'll just keep going and going and going. And then the irony, of course, is calculation is always entropic. It always uses up energy. It eventually burns out, right? Where I would argue apprehension is more negentropic. You don't actually use as much, you just apprehend it. In that intellectual act, the energy comes in what do you do now with your full body, with your life, right? The male will keep the entropic, like the question of, well, figuring out, but never move into the doing with the whole, right? Because they're spending so much time on the calculation. Now, again, if you don't calculate and build things, there's nothing to apprehend. But if you just build and you never apprehend, then you never move into the truth that is needed for rationality, not to become rationalism, right? And so those are some thoughts of the kind of connections between these things that I think the whole story is playing on. I'll give it to you on any thoughts about absolutely anything.
Yeah, and I think this plays a lot into how the structure of the masculine kind of fears the structure of the feminine. And you see this in the story where the boss is talking about the pools
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
how and how everybody has pools in their backyard, and then they hire the sailors to bring over the mermaids. Um, and that kind of ties along with the idea in modern culture too, where um, men will say, well, to be masculine, you have to make X amount of money and you have to build this space for this woman. You have to like build this empire or women won't want you. And so the pools were kind of like that. And but also how you were saying that it was like all the masculine only wants to look at the beauty. They don't want to look at all the awful parts of it. And the pool kind of like makes it so if the mermaid's trapped there, well, she can't really do anything. You just look at her, right?
Right.
But eventually the truth of the mermaid is that she's going to die there because she can't survive in a pool. She has to be in the ocean in the void. Um, and also, I know I'm kind of moving a
No,
little ahead here, but I'm really interested because you were saying about the apprehension, and I look at the tulip in the story as the thing that kind of pops up. to what the actual truth is, which it wasn't necessarily about his memory about the fawn. It was about his memory about his friend instead. And so he actually does get to the truth, but the thing that gets him there is a tulip. And you wouldn't the tulip has nothing to do with the fawn. So you wouldn't need so I feel like people would read it and be like, why is there a tulip there? Why does it keep popping up? And at first I was like, oh, this is just kind of nice scenery. And then I sort of built it around, oh, this is what the memory is actually about. And I end up doing this a lot in my stories. I don't know why. I just kind of go where it takes me, but it's always like some sort of like irony, like this is not actually what it's about. This is what it's about. But we couldn't get there until we talked about this and we jumped into the void and we brought up the tulips and all that. So I'm really curious on what you think, what you thought of kind of the actual truth that he got to.
I think that's wonderful. So there's a few things that come to mind. First, I'm really glad you brought up the pool, because I thought that was really important to the story on this idea of the difference between mermaid and pool, mermaid and ocean. You know, if they're in a pool, they can't pull you into the depths, right? You can just enjoy them. But the funny thing is, if you put the feminine in a pool to enjoy the beauty, the feminine can't teach you. It can't take you to what you want to need. So you can, in a way, you confuse the feminine as a trophy that you want, as opposed to a feminine as a kind of pull into the thing you need to face, right? And there's this long tradition. You know, I always talk about Beatrice because I find Beatrice fascinating in Dante, which, you know, popularly she is described as this kind of beautiful, you know, lady that Dante is following. But in the Commedia, there's a terror to Beatrice. You know, the example I always use, because I love it, is where Dante's like, Beatrice, why don't you smile? And she's like, well, at this point, if I smile, it will reduce you to ash and you'll die. Like, Beatrice is saying, I'm actually a Lovecraft creature, and if you're not careful, you will be destroyed, right? Like, the feminine and more medieval, in my opinion, a lot of the proper thinking about these matters are actually can be found in some of the greater literary texts on feminine and masculine. We just don't read them. And also, too, like on this idea of having to go into the depths to find yourself, which is a mixture of the beautiful and the horrifying. You see this in mythology very often. You see this in many of the great stories. But you see, here's the problem. You know, you said at the beginning that what you were trying to describe can only be in the form of a story, right? Like, it has to be a story. They actually, I do really think in the past understood that. But the problem is because you're under the reign of quantity, as Guran puts it, which is basically the reign of the masculine thinks by either or, more binary logic, right? So it's either good or bad, right? But the problem is reality is more of literature. It's a mixture of the good and the bad, which the feminine easily understands. Well, of course, right? But you see, the masculine is more so problem solution. So the idea that the beautiful and the horrific would be mixed together means there is no problem there is no problem solution. There's only a situation to manage, right? The feminine understands there's a situation to manage. The male is looking for problems and solutions. So then the way we come to understand beauty, good, horror, value, all of these things are in neat, clean categories, because that's how the masculine builds, which then actually leads to a false impression of how humans develop, which is by problem and solution. And then, of course, we're very confused and nihilistic and meaning crisis and different things like that, because we don't actually see, like, when we talk about nihilism, for example, well, nihilism can actually be the very medicine of nihilism if it is seen as the void to face, where then you find the thing that transforms you. If you just say nihilism is bad, well, it depends on what you mean, right? It depends on what you mean could be a very powerful feminine phrase. It depends. It depends. Like, the masculine does not say it depends. The masculine says yes or no, more naturally. And of course, we're using broad categories and everyone is a mixture of these things. But the key is that reality does depend. Reality is a thing that depends, just like a story. For a story to work, it depends on how you write it and how the elements add up. Like, again, a story is a testament to the feminine, because you can intend to have a great story with great characters, but it all depends on how you do it. You can't simply will art to be good. It sucks when you do that. You have to, like, tarry with it. You have to work with it. The success of art always depends on the most everything has to add up. It all has to add up. So I think this all of this confusion has greatly contributed to our inability to think the current moment. But on what you were saying with so I really appreciate what you were saying on the pools. I think it's a brilliant example. And also, before I forget as well, as I was saying at the beginning, the gradual introduction of more fantastical elements to warm the reader up to to what actually happens. You go with a squid and you're like, is that even real? Well, I guess it's realistic that a squid could do this. Maybe not. Then they're talking about mermaids. You're like, mermaid, is this serious or not? And then there is a mermaid. So you're like, oh, okay. So there's a gradual sort of warming that I think is structurally very, very good. And for anyone who is interested in creative writing, I think one should note how Sam is introducing fantastical elements into the story, where it starts off ambiguous if the fantastical elements are actually going to manifest into an actual experience of the fantastical, or if it's simply going to stay in a state of ambiguity. I think it's a very good move to introduce things ambiguous, then concrete, and then do something surprising with. Ambiguous, concrete, surprising, I think is a general way. And to me, the tulip is the surprising element to it. So structurally, the story makes a whole lot, it works very, very well. And you were saying that there are things that happen that you don't intend. Well, that's apprehension, of course. Like if you intended it all, it would be calculation. Great art has to become something that you just do, because if you calculated it, you would break it apart and it wouldn't work as a whole, right? So it's good that one does things that are not always within there, but that takes years of work. So that's a testament to you, Sam. On the tulip example, I think there is something very important there, because if I were to say to you, fawn, squid, male, ocean, tulip, you would say there's no relationship between those things, right? But the story shows there is a relationship between those things, right? So the idea of those things having something to do with one another is not intelligible to the calculating mind, to the rational mind, right? And so you say they have nothing to do with one another. But actually, human experience is always a testament to things that have no causal relation or necessary relation, nevertheless have a relationship with one another, right? And actually, the most meaningful things in our life are like that, which is more of an associational connection than a necessary connection. So for example, if I were to say to you, what is this cup? And you would say, well, it's a mug, for one. You don't know the difference. And no, I don't. I call things the wrong thing. So you say, this is a mug. You say, cool, what's it for? You say, well, for coffee. That's neat. We're all in the kind of utilitarian logic. But what if I said it was my grandmother's last mug? Oh, wow. There is suddenly a very powerful connection between this mug and my grandmother that doesn't exist in facticity, that also maybe only I know on planet Earth, right? But then the question is the following. Is that relationship real? Of course it's real. And yet it's singular, and yet it's individual, and yet it is not real in the same way of this being a cup that you put way too much coffee in. There are different connections. There are different logics of connections. And the funny thing is, although if I were to say, is there a connection between a fawn, a sailor, a squid, a mermaid, and a tulip, you would say absolutely not. But that's not because there is no connection. That's because the connection is so deep and so personal and so meaningful that only one person can really get it, and that's Thomas, right? So the most absurd associations run the double play of being meaningless or the most meaningful, right? But that's also the revelation of the void, right? The void is nothing, or it's not beautiful, or it is an apathetic fullness, right? So the issue becomes that human beings, we are transformed by associational connections into maturity or higher selfhood, more than just causal connections. You do not calculate and cause yourself by necessary cause and effect into maturity or a healthy masculinity or a healthy femininity or a healthy creativity, however we want to put it. That is not something that you can lie down and sort of say, oh, I do step A, then step B, then step C. No, it is something that has to be associated into and then apprehended together. And that's, I think, a feminine move. There's a feminine puts things together by association. So you lay all the data down and say, okay, we got here by this association, and this is how they connect. And then by the associational whole, you can then apprehend. And the maturity, dare I say, or the personal development comes from the apprehensive act. And I think this is very important. We tend to think that development is a result of planning and calculating. Okay, if I go to school here and I get this job and I calculate this much money, then I will be mature. That's the masculine notion of personal development. That's not how personal development works. That might be how stability works. That may be how financial stability works. That might be how climbing the career ladder works. And it has a role because we exist in a world of money and careers, but it is not personal development. Personal development is a product of associational gathering that is then apprehended, and then you get it. But this is how great literature works. Like, this is why we're in huge trouble to throw out literature, because literature is, at its finest, a laying out a whole that then characters don't tend to just do what is logically, they tend to follow associations or memories or emotions. Emotions have an associational logic to it, right? Like, great literature tends to follow an associational logic that then makes a whole of the entire story that then can be apprehended. And so the character in Thomas and having an apprehension of the tool with the tulip, that is also, for me, isomorphic to the experience of reading itself, actually, where you are gathering these different symbols and then there's an apprehension. And usually the conversation of literature afterward is the process of apprehension, but it is not the same kind of conversation as an engineer. Oh, okay, what are the parts we need to put together in order to calculate them together, right? So again, if we have and I'll throw it to you to respond to anything, and I don't know where time goes, is that, like, we have a culture that basically only, because of masculinity, basically calculates and engineers, right? And that's going to give us money and careers. But since we really don't have a culture that reads literature or does creativity, we've lost the epistemologies of association, gathering, and apprehension, without which you can't have personal development. And all of that also is only possible for those who face the void, go into the void. Like, you can't, I guess this is what I want to say. If you only stay on the surface, you can't, association and causation are basically indistinguishable because it's only like what's in front of you, right? So there may be associational logic, but it's meaningless. It doesn't have any deep meaning to you because the most of your experience is on the surface, where you are indeed just going one thing to the next. For associational logic, as I'll call it generally, to be meaningfully distinct from calculation, you have to add the vertical. You know, now we have a more higher geometrical, associational logic is different from calculation. I had to be brought into the void to find myself thinking things I didn't even know I would think or mean to think. I think that's really important with a dream. A dream, you find yourself dreaming things you didn't intend to dream. You're just doing it, right? Like daydreaming. You don't will daydreaming, you just do it, right? The void is a place where you just find yourself thinking things. And that, I think, we see in the experience of Thomas. He's just in a memory. He's just, boom, there's the, tulip. Okay, I see it now. Like, boom. But he had to go into the depths to have that associational grace almost, that associational occurrence occur, because you cannot will it. And I guess this is another thought that comes to mind. In order for the associational logic to bring you to the place of apprehension, you have to let your will die. You have to let something take you, right? You have to be pulled into something, because will cannot bring itself to the apprehension at the end of association, right? Because then you're just willing it, which means it's in the realm of calculation. So by definition, for apprehension for association to lead you to the apprehension by which personal development is possible, it must be in the void. It must be pulled into the place that you don't have control and that something can occur, or else you will never get that personal development. You will never have that thing. So for me, to throw it back at you at anything, I think it is extremely fitting that we have a character go into the void, and that the personal development, the development of that character then is actually through a kind of associational logic of things that don't seem to have anything to do with one another, but actually in the void, they come to have something to do together, because I think that's actually how human development works. We go into a void and things that we didn't know go together and we apprehend it. And then there's a personal development there. So to me, it was thematically, and it kind of goes together, because I actually do think that's true to life. But let me give it to you on anything.
Yeah, of course, that was all such a beautiful analysis, and I'm always really touched by like what you get out of out of what I write. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. And um also I want to touch on the masculine a bit, because when talking about the feminine, it does kind of sound like we're like putting down the masculine a little bit, but it's good to note that the masculine is extremely important for structure. If we didn't have it, then we'd just be in the void all the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And that would be a very chaotic place to be
yeah.
in. And so I do want to note that I do appreciate the masculine structure very, very much. Um, I think that it made me think of I know people always use this example, but it's a really good example to use. But like in terms of abortion, it's looked at as either right or wrong. But I feel like for years and years and years, we've just kind of been in this stagnant structure of it's either right or it's either wrong. But nobody has really thrown the issue into the actual void of it all and been like, well, why is it actually happening?
Hmm.
Well, why are women feeling like they need to? And just continuously asking why in that void to actually get to the core of the issue.
Yes.
And that way, when we come out of the void, we can get a higher form of the structure that's going to, um, I would say, uh, cause less pain to those it's affected by, or those it affects. So that's kind of how I would word it.
Yeah.
But I about the ending too, the very ending where he kind of like sort of comes out of that dream into the concrete reality. And I was reading it over again the other day, and I was like, wow, this is actually really, really sad because he went through all of that work to remember what the actual truth was. And then I don't know if you want to read a little bit of it, but the bartender kind of making fun of him that he's getting emotional, he then reduces it to nothing.
So,
I'm interested in no, I'm interested in what you have to say about the ending part because even that like makes me a little emotional because that's what happens a lot
yeah.
is you'll see a man actually become vulnerable and then society kind of like knocks him back into that like corner of oh no you have to stay in the structure.
Well, Tommy, the bartender said. Tommy glanced up from his drink with glazed, sullen eyes. You look like you've seen a mermaid in my drink. He cut the bartender off with a chuckle, loosening his tie. He threw his head back in genuine laughter. That's not what I was going to say, but I think I'll use that next time. Thomas cleared his throat. Yeah, no, I just remembered something. A friend who was kind to me. You're a bit of a mess there, the bartender laughed again, and Thomas averted his eyes to take another drink. Sorry, he gulped down his guilt. I didn't mean to laugh. It's just that I don't really see you being such a romantic. It's fine. I'll stay in this drink. The bartender tilted his head, and for a second he found it difficult to breathe. The air had become thin, like a cavern in the ocean. Tell me about it, the bartender croaked, a wisp in his eyes, but then the phone rang, and the sound of billiard balls cracked at the opposite side of the room. It's nothing, Thomas grinned, taking his last drink of alcohol for good. I think it's a lovely scene. I think that, so a few things. First, you're correct on what you're saying on the masculine, because if you're in the void all the time, if you have no ventilation structure or way to ventilate your experience of the void, it will destroy you, actually. Like, love must be Lovecraft because it overwhelms. The real must be encountered gradually. So you need the masculine for the filtration system, but the very success of the masculine tempts it to turn the filtration system into a wall. And then you don't ever get to the void that you need to develop, right? So the masculine, when dare I say, when masculine is at its best, it creates the filtration system of the void. The way to, because the amount of voids you can handle at 5 is different from 10, 15, 25, 30, and so on and so forth. But if you had no filtration system, everyone would encounter it at the same proportion at the same age, and it would overwhelm and lead to, well, psychosis, right? Like hysteria runs the risk of psychosis in a very bad way. But if you have no hysteria, you have no truth, right? And that's the tension. So it has to be a filtration system. There's a way to speak very generally where one might associate, we might say the feminine is associational to apprehension in the void, where the masculine is calculation to conclusion from over void, right? Like there's a kind of, or the filter, and you put those together and you get a certain filtration relationship that makes it the ability to craft love in a way we can sustain versus be overwhelmed. Those were thoughts. But on the final paragraph, I really like the final paragraph because there's this idea that for a moment, the bartender gets a sense of what Tommy is saying, and then he says, it's nothing. But the word nothing is fascinating because in a way the void is nothing, and we have to decide if it's a pregnant nothing or if it's a nothing that's nothing per se. And then Thomas Grin taking his last drink of alcohol for good. I love the phrase for good. I love that wordplay because it could mean finish, or it can mean that it's for the good of actually the nothingness coming to the forefront, right? Like if the mermaid is in the drink and the drink leads to the association with the ship, with the mermaid, with going into the void, then the drink could be actually the numbing to get you out of the masculine dominance to move toward the feminine, or it could be shutting the door. So there's an ambiguity that for me is given at it, but there's the possibility of a sad reading, which is true to the masculine experience because it's like, oh, sorry, nothing was going on. An embarrassment shut down. And in that shutting down, the masculine is not giving permission to other men to actually go into that space, but it's men jesting with one another, making fun of one another that leads to that locking of hell from the inside. I always like what C.S. Lewis said. He said, hell is locked from the inside. That's exactly right. And I think this is an example of, oh, well, let me shut it and then, keep myself in. We lock ourselves inside of our damnations, and I think that it plays out in social dynamics all the time. But this notion of the bartender says, tell me about it. That's a lovely wordplay because most people say, tell me about it in jest, but it could actually be a genuine cry. Tell me about it, please. Tell me about it. And Thomas says, it's nothing, right? So tell me about it. I think also the realism of the dialogue here is, and I don't know where time goes. The realism of the dialogue here is that it exists in this ambiguity space. Like the dialogue to work has to be believable while simultaneously suggesting another meaning, right? It is believable that the bartender would say, tell me about it in this exchange, but that particular phrase has a double meaning. Tell me about it. It's a plea, but it's also a kind of brushing off at the same time. Good writing, my beloved William Wilson always said that literature cannot pour the meaning from the top, meaning you can't force the pointing, right? Like you need the dialogue to point to this alternative meaning while at the same time functioning as if it's not pointing, right? Like you could easily read this as not pointing to anything and it'd simply be a believable exchange between people in a bar. But if it's in the context of the story, the double meaning going on. It has to work on both levels at the same time, or the higher meaning is poured in from the top. You must never, ever, ever, ever in your writing pour your double from the top, right? One of your greatest tools in writing for that problem is ambiguity. The phrase, tell me about it, is a double meaning phrase. Well, therefore, putting it here has it have this masculine plea, but also this masculine dismissal, right? So I think that's an example of very important skill in the creative writing toolbox. It's nothing is also beautiful because we've been talking this entire time how the void is pregnant, but in a sense, the void is nothing. So the nothing is pregnant, but it's nothing. He's like, it's nothing. That's, tell me about it. It's nothing. That's what you need, right? It's nothing and it's a dismissal, right? And then for good could mean for good. The nothing is for good for the actual encounter or finish off, right? Like that kind of phrase, that use of phrases there works extremely well to point to these higher meanings of the story while also creating a realistic dialogue. And I think that's extremely important. So for me, I took it as the story ending on this double of the possibility of it is ultimately in a tragic direction, but in its tragedy actually pointing toward the commedia, the, dare I say, ascent that is possible in the ideas of the story. And then I like the final paragraph. This is the peculiar, so it's nothing, and he takes the last drink of alcohol for good. That is the peculiar, and then space. That is the peculiarity of she, the mermaid, that is nothing. She was there all along, the void bridge that turned into art. She is a lifetime in moments such as these, 1,000 stories within a sip of beer to drink. I also like this because we were saying there's an associational logic that leads to personal development. I'm thinking of William Blake's famous idea that in a grain of sand, there's the universe. I'm thinking of the story, The Alpha by Borges, where he falls and looks under a stairway, and there's the Alpha of the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, where you see the entire universe all at once. Where nothing. The key is because there is no relationship between beer and a mermaid, there actually can be a relationship through nothingness between beer and a mermaid, right? Like the very lack of necessary relationship is why there can be an associational relationship that in its quantity is nothing, but that very nothing is why it can be a path of personal development, right? It is because things are not necessarily linked that they can be a road for personal development. So beer then associates into, fawn, ship, squid, mermaid, and it's like a grain of sand that each level on a kind of vertical axis, not a horizontal, falls into one another. And that falling like layers of paint in a painting, that is the road of personal development. The personal development, if I just keep using that phrase, is more of a movement through layers of paint in a painting per se than it is going to a destination. It's like Proust has that. Well, Proust would be, his whole remembrance of lost time is an associational logic of memory. And actually, before I forget, memory, dreams, associational in classical thought. Augustine basically says like the only way to actually find theology or God or higher truths is in the memory palace, which is going, and memory is associational. And Bergson basically says human genius is found in the interplay between intuition and memory, which is more of a feminine logic that is the truth of time, as a kind of time as duration, not merely sequence. Those are all different topics, but that's some of the philosophical background. But the idea that nothing, because something is nothing, it can be anything. Because something is nothing, it can be associated to anything, but that requires the going into. And what Proust said is that life is not so much about a journey to a destination as it is the kindling of new eyes. The ability to see things differently is actually what makes us, not merely going somewhere. And in fact, our obsession with journeys can be ways to avoid going into the void so that we see things anew, right? You will not feel as if life is full until you can look into a beer and see a mermaid. That is when life is meaningful. People talk about the meaning crisis. We think we're going to find meaning by going somewhere. You find meaning by gaining the capacity to, say, look into a drink of beer and end up in a tulip, right? That sort of associational movement, which is more feminine, is precisely the road of personal development, without which we don't, we just lock ourselves inside of hell, right? Out of shame and avoiding different things. And I think, to me, all of that, and then as 1,000 stories within a sip of beer, the infinity in a grain of sand, from the fawn to the tulip, that sort of associational, which is a nothing relationship, because there is no necessary relation between those things. But because there is no necessary relationship, that is why we can make there be a relationship if we're willing to actually face that nothingness. And in doing that, and knowing that it was us that did that, then we cannot say it was, say, causation or just the economy or some outside force that forced it. No, it had to have been us, which means it had to have been personal development. And that's an important point. When you're dealing with, and then I'll give it to you for any thoughts, and I know we're coming up on time, and I don't know where the time goes, and you're wonderful. Like, when we're dealing with personal development, if there is any plausible possibility that is a result of an outside force, like the economy or the government or whatever, then we actually can't know for sure it was personal development. It may have just been external causation or external influence, right? Like I was pushed into it, right? In associational logic that is in nothingness, if a connection arises, it must be personal development. There's no other explanation for how it occurred, because those connections don't exist. They're in nothingness. And so if you make them between the beer and the tulip, you must have done it. You must have brought about that development. And it must have been in you to find the 1,000 stories in that beer, in that drink, right? So that sort of process is the only one that can clearly shine forth as necessarily personal development, right? And that is the feminine logic. And so if you have a society that doesn't have feminine logic because it has been overly drunk on the masculine, which has value, but it creates a surface in which no vertical associational development is possible, then you will have an age of humans becoming like machines versus developing as persons. Because if we don't want to be replaced by the machine, then we're going to have to develop as persons. But that is only possible through the moving through layers of a painting and the associational connections of nothing, which is actually a pregnant apathetic possibility in which we can move from a beer to a tulip. And if we never make that movement, we can never be the kinds of people that we need to be fully persons. But let me throw it at you at any thoughts or anything at all, Sam. It's always a treat.
First of all, thank you so much for your incredible analysis. I always get so excited when you ask to discuss something because I'm like, okay, I like you put the words that I'm trying to say, like in philosophical terms, in technical terms, you do that so well. Where I'm more like, I'm gonna write a story and I'm gonna make this, you know, this mystical story that doesn't really seem like much, but under the surface, it's quite a lot that I'm saying. And also, I always I always think of Michael Scott when I write from The Office. That line where he's like, "Sometimes I start a sentence and I don't know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way." And that's it's almost kind of like throwing myself into the void. So sometimes, like, I'm trying to explain this very complex masculine and feminine, and I'm like, I don't really know how to do it in technical terms. So I turn to art, like writing and poetry, or writing short stories and poetry to explain what I'm trying to explain. And I think it's amazing how you can analyze the story and put all the technical and philosophical terms to it. I was talking to my friend about this the other day because she studies physics, and um, I said, you know, we all kind of we're talking about the same thing. We just have different terminology for it. So I'm so thankful that you can take something that I wrote from my heart, and you were able to analyze it in a way that the philosophical community would understand it. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for your just such kind words and such insightful thoughts. It was really incredible, and I'm so thankful I got to discuss this with you.
Well, I had a wonderful, wonderful time, and it is only possible because you wrote the story. So thank you for writing the story. And I mean, we cannot discuss the masculine and feminine in a way that is productive unless it's in a higher dimensionality, which is literature. Literature is a higher dimensionality of you could say situational thinking, the situation of what it is to be human, that you cannot get at if you're stuck in syllogisms or political binaries or things like that. Like the problem, and then people don't want to talk about these things because they're like, well, all that ever happens is people get angry. Well, then you repress, and then you're in real trouble, right? The problem, the opposite of repression is higher dimensionality, is bringing it to a higher dimension. The problem is, unfortunately, the humanities have not done a very good job of, dare I say, showing themselves as a higher dimensionality of these problems to put them in a way that actually can lead to productive, dare I say, productive thinking about it, or an address, as a term I like to say. Like, unfortunately, many literary professors say, well, this is just pleasure. It's just fun or stuff. Well, don't get me wrong. Yes, it's pleasure and fun, but I promise you, Dostoevsky was not writing because of the pleasure of it. He was writing because he was like, this, a lot depends on this. He's like losing everything, suffering. Like, look at all these authors who are sick on deathbed, losing everything. You think they're doing it out of pleasure. No, they're doing it because they basically apprehended something in reality that this story is really the only, dare I say, kind of proof or framing of it that actually gets at the higher complexity, that if you get at these problems in a lower complexity, then you make them worse. And that's what we don't always understand. When you are dealing with high dimensionality problems, or dare I say geometrical problems or situational problems, not algebraic, not linear problems, if you try to take on those problems from a lower dimensionality framework, you make them worse. You make them way worse. And you also cut off your ability to even think the alternatives, so you lock yourself from the inside in damnation. Like, that's the call. We've thrown out the humanities because we don't know what they are. And that is the mode of thinking of approaching higher dimensionality, without which you must ultimately end up locking yourself in hell from the inside. You must end up locking yourself in socially terrible dynamics and having no way to escape them. So the costs are high. But those costs cannot be avoided unless people are doing the work of writing stories like this. And ultimately, the truth, if you will, that of which makes us human, will have to be a story. Because a story is a higher dimensional proof that is more like the life we live, that contains in them all of the ideas. But you see, ideas that can't be brought into a story are probably just vapid. One should be very skeptical of any ideas that can be not brought into the story, in the same way we should be skeptical of any ideas that can't be brought into the body, right? Like if there are ideas you can't live or you can't bring into your whole body, they're probably just ideology. Likewise, ideas that cannot be in or as a story are probably just ideology and vapid, right? But actually, the best ideas require the story to come first in order to find their own fullness, because without the story, they're locked in the algebra where they don't go anywhere, right? So the story has to come first. Art has to lead. It's the non-rational that leads to the rational not falling into game theory dynamics. But you see, many artists, and this is a testament to you, many artists, precisely because their work requires them going, why am I doing this? What's the point? Why will I get anything out of this? Well, the story, the art, is the non-rationality that cannot be rationally justified, of which, if rationality does not have, it eats itself. So the artist has to have the bravery to do something they can't fully understand and maybe not able to put everything into terms, because it has to be that as the first step, or it would be rationally justified and then not leading to the higher dimensionality that would help us avoid our problems. If doing art was something you could quantify at the start, then it would not actually be the higher dimensionality that can get us out of a problem. It would just be adding to the noise. The very fact that doing art has to be done from this place of, I'm just writing the sentence to see what it means, is precisely its strength, is precisely why it can provide an address for us, and it can lead to thinking and philosophy that is not just enclosed in its own crystalline structure that leads to nothing. But the art, therefore, to exist, requires a step of courage and belief in it that cannot be rationally justified to come into existence, precisely so that it can help, say, the masculine not stay on the surface, but actually move into the void where it can find an apathetic beauty that is fullness. But that means it has to start with a certain courage, a certain grace, and a certain commitment that you have, because this story exists. And I enjoyed reading it. So thank you, Sam. It's been a complete treat.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely, Sam. Thank you so much. All the best to you. Thank you, ma'am.